In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. We just heard a story of a healing that Jesus did in the synagogue on the Sabbath. It's not the first story of Jesus doing a healing on the synagogue on the Sabbath. But it always seems to get this response, which is what the rabbi is saying. There are 6 days on which work can be done. Come on those days and be cured, but not on the Sabbath day. So, in this strange juxtaposition, here is a woman who's just been healed of an ailment she's had for 18 years. And the leadership is indignant because it was done on the Sabbath and broke a rule. Jesus ran into this all the time. And I thought I want to take a minute to kind of go back and look at the Sabbath and the rule making and what was going on. The Sabbath was intended from the beginning to be a gift to the people. The idea is a day of rest, a day in which you don't have to work. Because prior to the institution of the Sabbath, you could work somebody every single day of the week and never give them a break. Having a day of rest is good for body and soul. It's good for everyone, which is why the commandment, if you read the fine print in the Ten Commandments, it's not only the Jews, but everybody, the slave in your household and the visitor who's in town, they all get that day off, no work. So, what was intended for a gift over time developed additional rules to go with it. Rules as to what was considered work and could be done and what was not considered work and therefore could be done on the Sabbath day. The Jews had developed a philosophy called building a fence around Torah. So what I mean by that was in order to make sure they didn't break a law of Moses, they would, in a philosophical sense, build a fence around it by adding rules that wouldn't allow them even to get close to breaking the rule. Probably the most well-known example of that has to do with cooking. Right? Even today, in very observant Orthodox households, you'll find 2 sets of cooking pans, one for milk and dairy and another for meat, and you're never supposed to mix them. Why? Well, there's one commandment in Leviticus that says, you shall not boil a baby goat as a kid in its mother's milk. And we don't know why that commandment was there. Our guess is that was something that the Canaanites did, and so they didn't want to do it. So the commandment's there. You know, you can eat baby goat lots of ways, but not boiled in its mother's milk. But then to build a fence around that, they said, well, you know, if you use the same pan, there might, if you did milk or dairy first and then you use the same pan, there might be some left in there, and you would inadvertently break the commandment by having milk with the goat. So one set of pans for dairy, one set of pans for meat. You cannot break the commandment. Therefore, you have built a fence around it. That's the idea. So when it comes to observance of the Sabbath, by Jesus' time, there are all kinds of rules about what could and couldn't be done. And they were zealous to protect them. But the problem was that now the Sabbath, rather than being a gift that makes people's lives better, is becoming a burden of lots of unnecessary rules to the point where they'll make people's lives worse and more miserable sometimes. And this was what was happening. Here was a woman who was sick and could be healed, and they were told, no, you cannot do good today. It's the Sabbath. Come back tomorrow. And this was something Jesus challenged all the time. When God intends for us to do good and to help one another, the Sabbath, our religious observances, should not be an impediment to that. Now, that speaks of a problem, a bigger issue, or an issue that we face all the time, which is how to make moral decisions or how to deal with our own rules, both secular and religious, when they conflict. And this happens with us all the time. My seminary professor in ethics used to say, people think that ethics, being moral, is easy. You just do the right thing, you don't do the wrong thing. You do the good thing, you don't do the bad thing. But in point of fact, he said, real ethics doesn't start until you have many choices and they're all good, but you still have to choose one of them. Or all of your choices are bad, and yet you still have to choose one. Then is when it really happens. That's when you begin to get into conflict within your religious and moral universe as to how to solve this dilemma. An example, probably the best known one in the news these days of when all the choices are bad and you still have to choose one, is this issue about late-term abortions. Right? So when a woman is in the third trimester of a pregnancy, one of the things you can probably assume is that this is a case where they want the child. They've gone this far. By then, they may have already bought a crib, named the child, decorated the nursery, and then there's a piece of terrible news. Something is terribly wrong. Either there's something terribly wrong with the developing fetus, or there's something life-threatening to the mother, possibly both. And then she has to make a terrible decision where every choice is bad. And yet, still has to make one. I might add that for the government to step in and dictate what that decision has to be before knowing any of the particulars about the situation doesn't help. It's one of those things. And in any case, I would be remiss to think I know the answer. That's the answer that we have to, pray and deal with and hope we do the best that we can. How about an example of where you have a couple of choices and they're both good? I think the one that probably is most easy to recognize is the one parents face all the time. We want our children to have freedom to explore and do things and to learn things and, to make their own mistakes and make their own successes and stuff. And yet we also want our children to be perfectly safe. And we can't have both, right? If we're going to give a child freedom to explore and do things, there's an element of risk that comes with that. We can't keep the child perfectly safe. And so these are both good things. Learning, exploring, being free, and being safe. How do we weigh those two? How do we come to a decision? And again, I would say, without knowing the particulars of the child, of the situation, of what's going on, we really can't make a decision. It's not straightforward. We want to do what's best, but it's never easy. And that's the situation we find ourselves in all the time. One of the things that has happened to us, similar to the situation that Jesus found himself in with very strict rules about Sabbath that had gotten to the point of forgetting what the Sabbath was about to begin with, happened to us as well. Since the Enlightenment period, we have become obsessed with being certain about things. Prior to that time, we thought life was mysterious and we would never know everything and we couldn't be certain, and so it wasn't as big a deal. But now we believe that we can know the truth, we can know what a situation is, and we want to be absolutely certain that we're doing the right thing every time. But the problem is, just like we just described, that kind of certainty is elusive. That drive for absolute certainty is what has developed fundamentalism, right, all over the world. Fundamentalist religion is completely certain. Everything is black and white and clear. There's no gray areas. And yet, does it make people's lives better? Usually not. Frequently makes them worse. So, what would Jesus have us say or do about this situation? He doesn't give us a clear answer. And yet, in this story, he gives us, and in his ministry, he gives us a sense of how we might approach it. And the answer that he gives is the primacy of love. Right? When asked to sum up all the law and the prophets, Jesus said, the first commandment is this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is just like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on the night before he died, he said to his disciples, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. That love became the primal element, the first principle of how we live and make our decisions. And Jesus, when he gave his new commandment, said, and you can't just make up anything and call it love. I've shown you what it is. The way I have loved you, you should love one another. So, in the example of our gospel today, keeping the Sabbath is a good thing, right? But healing someone who is sick is also a good thing. What are we to do? Well, what is the most loving thing? Is it sticking rigidly to the Sabbath rule? Or is it healing the person who before you, who you have the power to heal and can be well and happy right now? That's an actually pretty easy decision. Love says, heal. Now, I can't say that every decision we'll ever have to deal with is going to be that simple and straightforward. But I will recommend that every time we deal with a difficult decision, to pause and say and ask ourselves, and what is the most loving thing to do? Because that's what Jesus did, and that's what he calls us to do as well. Amen.